Hi everyone, Shalina Critchlow here. Just wanted to introduce some amazing women here. We have Tiffany, Wakatuka, and Erin. We'll start with some introductions and we'll get into our discussion. And I'm going to go ahead and have Erin start.
Halito, Sifon Chifo, Erin Anhalt. That is how you say hello. My name is Erin Anhalt in Chattanooga, which is the Choctaw language. I am the chief of staff for the city of Greenfield, Massachusetts. I was a founding volunteer with SFI over 6 years ago. My husband was in the Navy for almost 22 years, and I am a citizen of Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma.
Kechamalea, Inepo Wakatukateak, Tuitaewe. What I said was Creator be with you, and that my name is Wakatuka, and have and good day. I am a Army retired veteran, 21 years federal active, 7 reserve, so I call it 28. And I'm happy to be here. I am a um, lodge leader, drum circle leader, poet, and songwriter.
Jate, I'm Patti Washday, Tiffany Wolf here. I'm a multimedia artist and designer. I'm also the host of Warm Embers podcast. I've almost been in this role as founder of Tiffany A. Wolf brand for a year. Prior to that, I was 18 years in environmental, working on habitat restoration, community outreach, and more recently, air data validation and policy. So thank you for allowing me to be here in this space. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'm going to go ahead and start us off with the first question here. And the first question I have is, what story about Indigenous military service do you wish you had been taught growing up? And how did learning the truth change you? And I'll go ahead and start with Tiffany.
So I wish that I had been taught that there were such the population of Indigenous service members is so large, and I feel like they should be much more notoriety of that in Western media because we are not really given props for the amount of people serving as being the First Nations, first people to be defending the land either through front lines, communications, running the equipment to keep the nation safe, as they say. I think there should be much more media and spotlights on that. And so my first understanding is through my Che. He was a Navajo code talker. So even that story alone just shows you the secrecy behind what was going on. And it wasn't until later in the 70s that it came out and they got accolades. But I still don't feel like it was as big a deal as it should have been during that time period. Because if we go even further back, there was Lakota code talkers, I think Kiowa Comanche, different code talkers were in the background of the military service, but I feel like it was not really talked about enough. For me, in school, I don't remember learning about that. So yeah, so that's what I wish, that there was more notoriety, more recognition, maybe a national holiday, like something to recognize that the people who were not given citizenship until, was it the 30s, had been defending the country for so long, such a large population. I mean, all of us have uncles, aunties, grandparents who have served, cousins, brothers, sisters, yourselves. It's like such a big part of our community.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'll go ahead and call on Wakatuka next to answer the same question. What about Indigenous military service do you wish you had been taught growing up? And how did learning the truth change you?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure how to answer that. I joined in 1983, right out of high school, and I hadn't heard any stories other than, my grandfather and my uncles who were all in Vietnam, and they didn't want to talk about it. Nobody talked about it. I just saw the bullet holes in their bodies, the what was left over, and nobody talked about it, and nobody, they weren't welcomed back with open arms. It was all that, baby killer and all that, negative rhetoric, negative light that was shed on that. It wasn't a positive thing. And so when I joined, I quickly realized that I was kind of alone there. There was the Hispanics, and there was the uh, African American nation. There was, the European nation, and I didn't know where to fit in. I didn't know how to fit in, because I was still learning about me, because, I just thought I was Mexican. I didn't have any idea, that the language that my grandmother was speaking and the things that they were saying were Yaqui, and to learn I was Chichimeca. And so, I lost myself in the military. I lost more of who I was, and my grounding. I had no grounding to hold on to, no spirituality per se. So I didn't have any stories to reference, and when I got in there, I quickly kind of disappeared in the formations, in the crowds, in the work that had to be done. So I don't really have a good solid answer for that question.
That was perfect. Thank you. Aaron?
Thank you.
I think that Shalina probably already knows my answer, but I think one of the things that has really that I didn't know until the last few years is the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons and nuclear waste on Indigenous communities, especially in the Southwest, as well as some Western tribes, Northwestern, like Cheyenne, Blackfoot, because it's more than just uh, when a bomb goes off. You have to think about the people who are mining and getting the uranium out of the ground, much of which is on Diné and Ute and Pueblo and Hopi and all the lands in that part of the country. And for decades, people who were either active duty or veterans were going into mines with only a hard hat as protection, and they suffer insane levels of cancer. And the military just dumped nuclear waste into lakes and rivers that were their only drinking water supplies, especially on Navajo Nation. And I don't think using the word genocide is too big of a word for what they did and what is the continuing impact. Of course, it's just one part of an ongoing genocide, but it's maybe one of the most recent and horrific phases because it is still happening. I wish that people knew that the cost of nuclear weapons in the military is so much bigger and broader than most people know, and it impacts Indigenous people more than anybody else.
Thank you, Aaron. Those are all really powerful answers, and I think it kind of touched on, environmental, injustices and history, right? And so thank you for all highlighting that. The next question is going to be, what do we owe the next generation of Indigenous service members, and what must change before we ask them to serve again? And I'm going to go ahead and call on Wakatuka to answer that first.
The immediate generation, even. I think we owe, in 1979, the Freedom of Religion Act allowed us to pray, sing, have ceremony, and things like that. I think that, because there's churches everywhere on bases and on forts and places. But where do we find the sweat lodge? Where do we find places to go to ceremony the way we know them? And, that includes ancient medicines, ceremonies. And instead of always pushing, medication and pills and things like that, how about holistic or ceremonial purposes that allow the Indigenous people that are serving now and coming to practice their ceremonies in some way. Like if, Sunday you go to church or you don't go to church and you just go to work, or you can find the ceremony and have that available through native contacts. That's what I think would be very useful
Thank
and impactful for our people. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Erin?
I really want to kind of piggyback on that because in over 22 years as a military spouse, I never met another Indigenous service member, not once. I know we are small in number nationally. We're, less than 5% of the population, and that makes it much harder to find our people. Like, I'm currently in Massachusetts. My tribe is in Oklahoma, but there's still solidarity to be found with people. You find stomp partners wherever you are, and you go dance, and you go. I've made Nipmuc and Narragansett and Wampanoag friends up here in Massachusetts. And when we lived out west, I had friends who were Cheyenne and Lakota. And when we were in the south, everywhere you find people. But in the military, it does make it harder because we are isolated, and I would love to see more thoughtfulness in where people are assigned, so that they weren't the only Indigenous person on a base, and I have a Jewish friend who never was stationed with another Jewish person either. This isn't something that is unique to our communities, but to all underrepresented communities. We need to know that we have family where we go. And for especially in Indigenous communities, there are things that are pretty universal across all of our communities in North America. All of us have some sort of sweating. All of us have some sort of, we burn cedar, not sage, but it's still smudging. Finding people who can connect on those things, who will look at your new shiny earrings and be really excited. Those things are important. And I think that the military should really think about that inclusivity, because Indigenous service members also have an incredibly high rate of self-harm. And a lot of that is because we don't have connections to our people in the ways that a lot of other people do. We are so isolated. And especially for people on the East Coast, where there are not nearly as many tribes as out west, it's even harder.
Thank you, Erin. Tiffany?
I would like to come from the perspective of like economics. So my son, when he was graduating high school, he was telling me, "Oh, if I sign up for the military, I get $10,000." To him, that sounded like a lot of money, and I feel like there's a lot of poverty in our communities, and I think that could be enticing
Mhm.
to youth to just sign up. And I've heard a story of an 18-year-old who signed up because of the bonus, didn't tell his parents, and then he was went away when his parents like, "What did you do?" But he was already 18. So I feel like there should be more like economical responsibility to our youth, more of a counseling, like, is this what is the end goal, pathways for like career. Yeah, I think that our youth should be given more of understanding and education of this is what the commitment is, not like here's the dollars. So
Uh,
that's my perspective.
Thank you. That was incredible, and I love how everyone kind of touched on something a little bit different. And it's important to have these conversations and talk about, the lens, like you were saying, that from the economic standpoint and from ceremony and from mental health, that all is very important for our community. So thank you all for highlighting that. The next question I have is, what has military service cost you or your family that the public never sees or acknowledges? And I'm gonna start with Erin.
I don't know. It's uh, we gained so much from the military, and we continue to even after retirement. I think that one of the biggest things that it did cost us was, my kids were all, either teens or almost teens when my husband retired. And we didn't have in their childhood a sense of family or community outside of the military because we were moving and living away from people. And I don't know what that's going to look like long term. They're still young, but I think that there's definitely something lost that I grew up with, where you have your people and your community around you, and they didn't grow up like that. And I don't know. I think that's probably one of the biggest things.
Yeah. Thank you, Erin. And Tiffany?
From what I saw in my personal relationship with my Che and my dad was the mental health impact. So throughout my Che's life, he suffered PTSD, what we now know as PTSD. Back then, I don't think it had a name, but he would go to different healers. He would have nightmares. His wife had to sleep in a different room because sometimes he'd wake up trying to attack her because he just like wake up in survival mode. And he just really, he went to Panama. He would always go to our traditional healers. Even when I was 15, like 2 years before he passed, he was still doing ceremony to help get rid of the memories that they still haunted him. So I think that's one of the things that people didn't see. Like on one end, it's like celebratory, yay, code talkers. They're doing these parades, the Rose Bowl, meeting the president, getting these declarations. But on the back end, he suffered from alcoholism, haunted by these memories, scarred, still doing ceremony. And then he had to stop drinking because of his medication. But he'd been drinking so long, he didn't even last, I don't think, a year and a half. And he had passed from complications. But I just think that's something we don't talk about. And then with my dad, also, he never wanted to talk about his service. He had a tattoo that said USN, but he would say United Sioux Nation. And I would ask him, but he wouldn't want to talk about it until one night he was like, I will tell you, it was the scariest thing ever. He was an ammunitions boat going back and forth. I don't know if it was like Korea, but he said it was so scary. They never knew if they were going to be attacked because they were hauling the ammunitions and they were in constant fear. So I'm sure being in that heightened fear mode all that time had to have, an impact. So I feel like we see the flags flying, the jets and the all the celebration, but we also don't talk about the mental health aspect.
Thank you, Tiffany. I really appreciate that. Wakatuka?
Wow, you guys hit on so much. What it cost me so much. I talk about, my spirit being split in two, feeling incongruent. And that's because of when I joined, it wasn't don't ask, don't tell. It was don't even think about it. You know, there was no don't ask, don't tell didn't come till about 93 with Clinton. And I joined in 83. And so imagine, having to feel like a fraud and a liar, feel like a fake every day of your life, every day, and not being able to be yourself, and what happens to your spirit in that daily struggle. Not to mention alcoholism and drinking to get along, to get by, to make it, working hard, but also drinking. Oh my goodness, copious amounts. I can't even. And I'm 18, and I'm being told you got to go to alcohol awareness classes, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. And so um but that was the when I joined, they were still drinking beer at lunch. It was legal
Wow.
to go. First sergeant had a little refrigerator in the office. He's drinking beer lunchtime, no problem. Just don't smoke pot, you know. And because they would do, random, and they still do random urinalysis tests, and it cost me so much in having to deal with sexual trauma having to deal with harassment, having to deal with coming out with PTSD because all of it, wartime or not, you know, being a woman in the military was one of the most difficult things. Not only a brown woman, an indigenous woman, people touching your hair without even asking. Oh, your hair's so pretty. Let me touch it. You know what I mean? Like, the hell? I'm not an inanimate object. I am a human being. Do not touch me. I remember going to, and I'll end after this. A busload of soldiers, and we were in North Carolina. I think it was called Blackbeard, North Carolina. And the owner of the store came out, a white man, and came out and said, "Only the white soldiers can come into my store and use my bathroom. So the rest of us had to stay on the bus." You know, so it cost me my dignity. It cost me my self-worth. It cost me having to navigate where do I fit in this world?
Mm,
It's black and white and I don't fit,
mm,
you know, and so it was dangerous and it was painful. It's painful now, you know, it makes me want to cry now. Uh, and so, you know, we're still healing. We're still healing from all that complex trauma, complex, because it wasn't one day. It wasn't one moment. It was every goddamn day for 28 freaking years. And I stayed, and I'm so grateful now that I did, you know, because, you know, I don't have to go back into the rat race. I can just heal. I can take time and heal. So thank you for that question.
Thank you all for the answers, and from what I heard, it seems like it costs, you know, identity, it costs safety, it costs a sense of belonging, and so much more. So, you know, with so much respect, I thank you all for answering those questions and being vulnerable and being authentic and just being yourselves. And I really appreciate that, and thank you so much.